I'm going to be speaking about a sort of a controversial topic because I'm mixing together things that are supposed to be unmixed in our day. And you have to decide whether or not it's a valid mixture. But the topic that I'm wanting to share, I'm calling a Christian understanding of psychospiritual problems. And so you can tell just by the way I'm framing it there that for me, psychology and spirituality are not to be radically distinguished. I think it's better to see them as two sides of the same coin, different ways of talking about the life of human beings. Psychospiritual, the psychospiritual realm is one realm and many different things that we can emphasize. But of course, we're living in an age where fragmentation of our lives is the norm for various reasons in the modern era. And part of my mission, I suppose, and I hope in a way, I hope yours too, is to undermine the fragmentation of human life that has developed in modernity, and to seek to see all things under the lordship of Christ, the creator and redeemer of humankind, because that the spiritual dimension then is the great unifier of life. And that's the way God made us. And so there's something very insidious. That's a big English word, not a usual English word. Something really deeply distorting about the tendency in modernity to separate and divide things, so that, for example, in the Middle Ages, theology was understood to be the queen of the sciences. And I think that's a right way to think about the Christian university. But in the modern era, of course, it was, terribly demoted, along with a lot of other kings and queens in Europe. And instead, resigned to the religion department, and where really theology doesn't have a distinctive role, but it's a very pluralist department. And there's a place for that in the modern university for studying world religions. I'm not against that, but within a Christian scheme of things, theology, I think, continues to need to be seen as what I call a meta discipline. It's a discipline that's at the center of our lives, along with, I think, Christian philosophy and spirituality. All three of them, I think, have a pivotal role to play, a central role to play in our understanding of life, particularly of human life. So I'm lumping together, I'm bringing together sin, suffering, and biopsychosocial damage. And so let me begin by defining what is psychopathology. That's a word that probably most of us are familiar with, but in the field of medicine, pathology, at least in English, is the term for the study of diseases and disorders of the body, pathology. And so at least in America, probably in England, the term psychopathology has been used in psychiatry because psyche is the Greek word for soul, and you put that together, and psychopathology is the study of the diseases or disorders of the soul. And what I want to do, even though the term psychopathology emerged in the late 1800s or early 20th century, I like to take terms that are used and were defined by somebody else, by a different worldview community, and seek to translate them into a Christian meaning. I think there's some power in that. I think we have to be careful when we do that. So I try and use an adjective to distinguish the modern understanding of the term from a Christian understanding of the term. But in modern psychopathology, the worldview that underlies it is naturalism. And there's a lot of forms of naturalism. Humanism is one of them. Postmodernism is a form of naturalism. So there's different forms of naturalism, but at the basis of naturalism, reality consists entirely of natural things and processes. And at least in hardcore naturalism, I need to distinguish that. In hardcore naturalism, there's no spiritual or ethical realities. Everything is due, all of psychopathology is due to biological or social causes. And that exhausts modern psychology's view. And I think there are things right about this approach, and we've learned a lot. The Christian community has learned a lot from modern psychopathology. Biological and social dynamics do cause and influence psychological and spiritual problems. In fact, I'm reminded of a book on melancholy, and that's in English. It was written in English by Robert Burton around 1690, going way back. But this is a Christian book on depression, using the old word melancholy. And he has sections that talk about biological causes of depression and social causes of depression. This goes back to 1690. This was not a new thought. This was commonly accepted throughout the Christian era, not by everybody, but by those who were most learned. So of course we agree with this, and the research that's been done over the last 100 years is wonderful and extremely helpful. We're grateful for the grace of God that has given to our era insight into biological and social causes or influences of psychospiritual problems. The problem, however, is that it reduces humans to being a mere organism and not the kind of unique organism that God created us to be. So it promotes determinism, victimhood, and passivity. And it undermines human freedom and human responsibility, which are both very important themes of a Christian view of human nature. So I want to suggest that what we need to do in our day in the Christian community is develop a Christian psychopathology, a Christian version of psychopathology that's based on our worldview. And we're going to learn things from modern psychopathology that we want to bring into our version, but at the basis of it, we're going to see human beings as personal agents made in God's image, as well as organisms. And that it ends up being a more comprehensive view of human beings. I've written about human beings as best understood as according to 4 orders of meaning. The biological order is one of those. The psychosocial order is another. And that's really what modern psychology and psychiatry focus on. But in addition, a Christian view is going to include an ethical dimension and a spiritual dimension. And then we have a more holistic view of human beings. And it corresponds kind of neatly then to this approach to psychopathology, where we talk about sin and sins. That's an important distinction we'll look at, as well as what I call psychosocial damage or disability and biological damage or disability. And so we want to do justice to all the complexity of human beings and not reduce us too much to mere organisms. So let's begin with sin, and in each case, we're gonna try and connect this to Jesus, because Jesus provides a special window within a Christian psychology and psychiatry on the particular problems that we're looking at today. So the biggest challenge that I'm bringing here today is, how on earth can I suggest that sin is a type of psychopathology? I'm obviously departing from modern psychopathology's understanding, and I understand that not everybody agrees with this. Probably most Christians in the field of counseling and therapy would not agree with this. They would say I've made a category mistake. Sin belongs in the category of theology, and psychopathology belongs in the category of psychology, psychiatry. I'm thinking of a British neuropsychologist named Malcolm Jeeves, who has written about the brain and from a Christian standpoint, and he would disagree sharply from my approach. I recall that he talks about the difference between guilt and anxiety. And he, back when he wrote the book I'm thinking of, Psychology Both Views, I think it's called, he suggests that guilt does belong in the area of theology and pastoral care. Pastors are charged to deal with guilt. But anxiety, he says, that's a psychiatric or a psychological condition. And that's not for pastors to address. That's for psychotherapists or psychiatrists to address. So I'm aware that I'm breaking the rules here, but I think these rules need to be broken. And I say that because the rules emerged in the late 1800s. This is a newer thing than a Christian approach. A Christian approach would have seen anxiety and guilt with under the authority and lordship of Christ. And so sin is a biblical word for disorder of the soul. I think I'm being pretty accurate when I define sin as a disorder of the soul. However, sin is an ethical disorder, a spiritual disorder. We might say it's a disorder of love. And so I concede that it's a unique kind of disorder, but that, it's still a disorder of the soul. It's as if God put a circle around a set of problems that we have and said to us in the Bible, these are the most serious, and you bear some responsibility for these disorders. So focus on them, especially with my help. So why is sin so important in the Bible? Admittedly, the Bible talks a lot more about sin than it does any other disorder. A lot more, right? It doesn't talk much about biological problems. We kind of have to infer them to some degree, unless it's talking about diseases in general. So why is sin so important to Christianity? Well, in a God-centered universe, there is nothing more important than God's glory. And sin robs God of glory. So sin, in a God-centered perspective, sin is the worst thing in the universe. It's the worst kind of disorder because it undermines, it mysteriously attacks God's glory. We're meant to be centered around God, and sin decenters us from God. It's like a black hole in astronomy. And it sucks us into this place where there is ultimately no light, or even light gets absorbed. Even the good gets absorbed by sin. We don't understand sin very well, but that's why it's so important. So how do we think about sin? Well, it's not I said it's a thing in the previous slide, but it's really not a thing because it wasn't created. I shouldn't have called it a thing. It's really a relational disorder. It's a disorder in our relationships, rather than it being like a cancer, like a tumor. We can use metaphors like tumors, like, like a black hole, but it's really relational more than it is a thing. And it's primarily a disorder of relationship with God. It's a kind of autonomy from God. We're born in sin, and therefore we're born with a kind of autonomy from God in our hearts. We still live dependently on God for everything that we do, that we benefit from, but we act as if we're autonomous. And we're characterized, according to the Bible, by having hatred of God and having hostility to God. Now, of course, this is unconscious for most people. We're not aware of the degree to which we resist God, because we're made in God's image, and part of what sin does is it masks this tendency to be aware of our hatred and hostility of God. Yeah, I might mention a book I recently reinvestigated by Soren Kierkegaard, the great Christian psychologist. Soren Kierkegaard, he wrote the greatest book on sin, I think, ever, called The Sickness Unto Death. And there he shows that sin is largely unconscious. We're not conscious of sin. And that's its greatest problem for us, because we're not aware of it. But I've already called it a disordered love, where we love creation more than the creator. But as I've said, it's usually unconscious. And that's why it's so deadly to us. We're not really aware of how pervasive it is. The Pharisees are a profound revelation to us in the Bible of how unconscious sin really is, because they had no idea how oppositional they were to God in opposing Jesus. And that's why we need to read the Bible to understand sin and to read about the Pharisees, because we have that same tendency that they had. But also sin destroys human beings. It destroys ourselves. It is like cancer. It's self-destructive, and it leads us to hate others, and it leads us into racism and to hate people just because they're different from us in some way or other. That God created differences can be a source of sinful opposition to one another, and so we want to put racism to death in the Christian community and in the world at large. Sin is a relational disorder. Well, there are three kinds of sin. I'm going to go really quickly for time's sake. Original sin is a teaching that Christianity has. Judaism and Islam do not agree with this doctrine, but it says that we're born with an inborn propensity to resist God's centrality and glory. And this is taught in Romans 3 very clearly. Also, the dimension of sin that most people are more familiar with, even non-Christians know about this understanding of sin, but sin being a deed, an action that we can commit. And we become personal sinners when we sin in that way, when we commit a sin. These are deeds, behavioral deeds. They can be mental. We can fantasize sinful things in our minds, Jesus taught us. And but these are actions that are contrary to God's norms or God's will for our lives, God's design plan. And we can say, as people have said throughout the history of the church, that sins are influenced by our biology and by socialization. Growing up in families that are angry lead us to become angry adults. That's a tendency that we pick up, that we absorb in our families, for example. And then a third aspect of sin that's very important, and that great Christian philosophers have, like Thomas Aquinas, have wrestled with this, but also the feature called vice, that if you practice sin over time, it turns into a vice, which is a sinful habit that predisposes us to continue committing that sinful deed again. And it gets wired into our brains. Now we understand that it's wired into our brains, influenced by biology and socialization. But the feature of sin that's most important for us is that we're agents of it. We cause personal sin and vice because we're born in sin. And as we grow and develop in childhood, we end up sinning. I think particularly this emerges in adolescence, and they come to shape our character. So sin is the worst form of psychopathology, I think, from a Christian standpoint. But another kind of psychopathology is suffering. And this is maybe a little different way of thinking about psychopathology, but I would argue that it is psychopathology because it's a strong negative emotion or psychological physical pain. And when we experience it over time, it works itself into, it can, I should say, work itself into a form of psychopathology. So, what does, I can't read that. I don't know if you can, but what is unique about a Christian view of human suffering? The Bible teaches us that all humans suffer. The Bible teaches us in Proverbs, especially, personal sin leads to suffering. Really, much of the Old Testament underscores that. However, the book of Job teaches us that not all suffering is due to personal sin. And we have some wonderful themes here and there that suffering brings about wisdom and spiritual maturity. And these are incredible lessons in the Bible about suffering, about this psychological disorder called suffering. I should make clear, we were not made for suffering. We were created for a perfect world. God created us for a perfect world. That's what we were designed for. However, God also knew that and planned that we would end up in a sinful world and we would be sinners. And so he wired us, prepared us for suffering. And that's why we have negative emotions, for example, to respond to the world in which we live. And so suffering is a part of life down here, but it leads to psychological disorders, and therefore the Bible does address it in some detail and gives us some great wisdom about it. But there is so much we don't understand, and there's much about suffering that the Bible doesn't directly address. For example, there is much about suffering in childhood that we don't understand, and it's not talked much about in the Bible, and we've learned much about it as a result of some important research in the last 50 years. For example, we now understand that neurons are in our brain get organized into networks, neural networks, in childhood. And these neural networks can be integrated with one another as we develop. That's God's design plan. But if we suffer a lot, they can become disconnected and dissociated and never connected. And we also know that children suffer sometimes horribly. And we've come to learn and appreciate, for example, in a great book in the English language called The Body Keeps the Score, which was written by a Dutch fellow who lives in the US, and I believe it's been translated into a number of European languages. The Body Keeps the Score. I don't know what it's called in your particular country, if it is been translated. But that book, for example, talks a lot about how children who have suffered a lot store negative emotion schemes in their brains and in their memory systems. And they can be prone to re-experience those emotions throughout their lives, so that when we grow up into adulthood, we re-experience them. And severe suffering in childhood, long-term trauma, results in brain souls. I like that term. Not everybody uses it, but brain souls. We are brain souls. That's how we were created. Thomas Aquinas taught that. That we are brain souls. But as a result of severe suffering in childhood, it results in brain souls that do not function according to God's design plan, because they come to form significant patterns of dissociation. Parts of our experience get cut off from one another, and they may or may not manifest themselves in adulthood in ways that can be harmful to ourselves and damaging in our relationships. So what we find then is that suffering can lead to psychopathology. In fact, severe suffering is linked significantly to all major forms of psychopathology. I can't think of, autism, mental impairment, are not related to suffering in childhood. So there are some forms of psychopathology that are not, but the vast majority of forms that are in the ICD-9, for example, are related to, more or less strongly related to, suffering in childhood. Lastly, I want to talk about biopsychosocial damage. We have a word for weakness, asthenia, that I think is a helpful category, biblical category for biopsychosocial damage. It's a word for physical illness. It's also used for poverty, but it can refer to any physical, psychological, or spiritual limitation. There are some words that, some passages where the term weak is used that you may be familiar with, but Paul was attacked for his weakness by teachers at Corinth, and particularly in 2 Corinthians. That whole letter is about weakness. And in that letter, apparently he was being criticized for being weak, and some of the leaders in Corinth were saying, he claims to be apostle, but how, he must not be a very good apostle, or maybe he's not a real apostle, because he's got these weaknesses. And he mentions two of them in the letter. He admits, I don't have a very impressive personal presence. My personality is kind of dull in some ways. Apparently that's what he's saying. And apparently he had some kind of difficulty in speech. He doesn't spell it out, but some have speculated he may have had a stuttering problem. We don't know, but he admits he's got a weakness in that area too. And then in chapter 11, he goes through a whole list where he says, honestly, you don't know the half of it. Let me tell you all these problems I have in my life. I've suffered. I've been persecuted. I've been imprisoned. He goes on, and he says, at the end of that chapter, he says, one time I was so weak, I was let out of a city where I was being criticized as out of a basket, secreted out, like a baby in a basket. You're right. I'm as weak as weak can be. He kind of says this. It's quite an amazing passage, but of course that leads into a very profound understanding of weakness that follows in chapter 12 that I'm going to take us to in a minute. And so when you compare biblical teaching on sin with biblical teaching on weakness, you see that God treats them very differently. He judges and punishes sins, but he expresses concern for those who are weak and sick and poor, and he wants them to be protected. The book of Proverbs says he watches over the poor, for example. And then we are to view our sins and our weaknesses in opposite ways. We're to confess our sins and repent of them. There's something we have responsibility for, and we're to do what we can to get rid of them so that we don't practice sins. On the contrary, we're to boast, Paul says, in our weaknesses. You remember, he says in that great passage in chapter 12, that I have God, to keep me from being too prideful, God gave me a thorn in the flesh. And we don't know what it is. Some have said it's a stuttering problem, but we don't know. And I'm glad we don't know, because it's weakness is what he's saying here. And we all have weaknesses of some kind. And Paul says that our weaknesses God uses to humble us so that we don't get too proud and arrogant, thinking we're so great and special. And so he says, you remember this passage in your language, I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness so that Christ's power may rest on me. That's why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, insult, hardship, persecution, difficulty. For when I'm weak in myself, I'm a vessel for God's power to work through me more clearly. What a contrast between these two ways of thinking. Sin is created by humans. We created it. God did not create it. It's something God hates. It's something we're responsible for in our practice, in the way we live. And it's something we're to confess and resist. By contrast, weakness, I would call it creational damage, not due to our personal sin, with some exceptions that we need to get to. But the way Paul talks about it, it's not due to sin. It's something God actually values. It's something we're not responsible for, at least in the form that Paul's talking about. And it's something that we can actually learn how to boast in. Very, very amazing. So what are the implications of this teaching for psychopathology? Well, I'm just going to throw out some ideas. I'd like you to think about them. You can talk about them in the group time. Autism, I think, mental impairment as well, is a kind of weakness. I think if a person is suddenly overwhelmed by hallucinations that come out of nowhere, and there are a few conditions where that happens, I would use that as an example of a weakness. Paranoia would be also a case of that. Depression that an adult has that's due entirely to child abuse, I would say that's a weakness. That's not a sin. That's the opposite of a sin. That it's a result of somebody's sin against the person, and they should not be held responsible for depression that's due directly to child abuse, long-term chronic child abuse. And then I'm going to throw out this idea. We ought to have time to talk about it, but we'll see. I would like to discuss this with you. I'm going to suggest that a person who has same-sex attraction, that's a weakness. If they've never acted on it, if they are in adolescence and they find that they have desires for same-sex sex, and they've never sought it out, that's an example of a weakness. It's probably related to biology and maybe some socialization influences in their life. And we ought to interpret it as a weakness in the way that God does. Teaches about weakness. That's what I think. But let me suggest that let me make it even more complicated. And this is really complicated. And if this is the first time you've ever seen something like this, this is kind of, you can get a kind of this can be kind of hard to get a hold of. But I believe it. I've been teaching it for years, and I think it makes sense. I think there are some conditions. In fact, I think there's a lot of conditions in human life that are both sin and weakness. Poverty is one that's taught in the book of Proverbs. There are some verses that say that we should not harm the poor. We should look out for the poor. God loves the poor because they're poor, and it's a weakness. And then there's other verses in Proverbs that says that poverty is something that we cause because of negligence or laziness. And there's another important passage where Jesus is confronted for eating and drinking with tax gatherers and sinners. And he says to them, "It is not those who are well who need a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call righteous men, but sinners to repentance." And he uses a metaphor here that in other passages is weakness. It's a kind of sinfulness, is a kind of sickness. And you see that in the kind of people that Jesus hangs out with throughout his life. So I'm going to suggest that there are some kinds of conditions that are both weakness and sin, and I'm going to call them faults. And I get this from Paul Ricoeur, the great French Christian philosopher. But in English and French, the word fault has a double meaning that points both to personal responsibility and brokenness. And so I think it fits really well with this condition. So let me give you some examples. Depression that a person develops because they've lost a job, because they weren't working hard in their job. They were playing video games on work and they were caught 3 times. And the 3rd time they got fired, and they're responsible for that. And they develop depression. And developing depression always has some biological side to it. It's a brain state. And therefore, I think it is a weakness of sorts. But in this case, it's also a weakness that in some way was caused by a person's irresponsible behavior. I think alcohol addiction begins as an innocent act. I think it's okay to drink alcohol, but over time, if we drink it to excess, we can start to develop an addiction. And it's an addiction that we're responsible for. And it's why addiction is considered a sin in the Bible. But we understand better now than ever that there is also a strong biological side to addiction. So it's both a weakness and a sin. Habitual anger is an example. Paul says quite clearly that in some places that anger, wrath can be a sin. And it's a vice. It's one of the 7 deadly sins. But if I said this earlier, if we grew up in a household that was biologically predisposed, the genetics in our family predisposed us to strong aggression and anger, and then we grew up with angry family members, we were born and socialized into anger. And that's a weakness. However, as an adult, I'm responsible for that. For my anger, for my angry outbursts. It's both a weakness and a sin for me as an adult. And then lastly, I'm going to suggest that same-sex sexual activity is a sin, but it's also been shaped by, in most cases, it's been shaped by a weakness that a person may be biologically, socially predisposed towards. But whether or not we act on our predispositions is a sin issue. Let me say something here at this point. There is a group in America of people who are responsible for 90% of aggressive crimes. And I wonder if you know who that group is. 90% of aggressive crimes in America are a result of this group of people. They're called men. And men are much more likely, because of testosterone and socialization, to commit aggressive actions. That doesn't mean that there's not any responsibility for that, just because there's a biological predisposition. So I think there's many conditions that are both biological and weaknesses. I've written about this in God and Soul Care, and I just want to remind you, I'm from the Gideon Institute of Christian Psychology and Counseling, and I'm so happy to be here with you.